Full screen. I love a full screen.
Aha. So I think we're live. Hopefully everybody can hear us. Um, Hello and welcome everyone for joining us for an evening with Wilson Cruz. I'm Rakesh Satyal. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Lambda Literary, and I'm thrilled to be your host tonight for the first installment of Lambda Literary Does Pride, a series of readings and discussions with a few of our community's brightest stars. To see our full list of events, visit our website at lambdaliterary.org. Books have always been central to queer culture and identity, which is why I am so proud of the work that Lambda Literary does. Many of you might be familiar with the Lambda Literary Awards, which celebrate the best LGBTQ+ books of the year. Since 1989, the Lammys have asserted the distinct value and power of queer literature. The Lammys are just one part of our work. Lambda Literary also brings LGBTQ+ books into schools so that kids, especially queer and trans youth, can see themselves reflected in the books they read in school. We also prepare future generations of queer writers by offering the only writing residency in the world exclusively for emerging LGBTQ writers. And I must say, as an author myself that's participated in that program, I love it very, very much. These programs and others are only possible because of financial support from people like you, which is why I ask that you can make a donation to Lambda Literary tonight by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Like many people and organizations, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an enormous impact on us, and this June we need to raise $25,000 to continue our work throughout the year ahead. Please help us ensure that Lambda Literary can continue to respond creatively and powerfully as we move through this tumultuous time. Even giving as little as $10 ensures that we can keep bringing you programs like tonight's in the months and years ahead. You can contribute to our work at any point tonight by clicking the donate button as mentioned before at the bottom of your screen or visiting lambdaliterary.org. And with that, I will introduce tonight's reader. Wilson Cruz is an American actor known for playing Rickie Vasquez on My So-Called Life, Angel in the Broadway tour production of Rent, and Dr. Hugh Culber on Star Trek Discovery. Throughout his career, Cruz has served as a fierce advocate for gay youth, especially gay youth of color. So welcome, Wilson, to our event.
Thank you for having me. I'm very proud to be here with you guys.
I have to say, I actually found out this fact today because I am a huge My So-Called Life fan, and I'm 39 now. So I was the age of being in high school when that show premiered. And the funny fact I found out today, it premiered literally on my birthday of the year that it came out.
In August?
Yes. Yeah, August 25th. Yes. Yes. So it was so meaningful to me to see your character in particular on screen. It was just so fundamental. And I think that's true of many, many people who are joining this event tonight. So I really thank you for that. Just to tell people about the format. So Wilson is going to read just one advisory that the passage that he'll be reading does use the N-word. It's James Baldwin. Those are Baldwin's own words. We just want to make sure we have that caveat at the beginning here. And so feel free to send in questions. We'll be culling those. And then after the reading, I'll have a couple questions for Wilson and we'll pose some of yours and it should be a lovely discussion. So take it away, Wilson.
Thanks for having me. I'll be reading from The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Very first chapter, My Dungeon Shook. A letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation. Dear James, I've begun this letter 5 times and torn it up 5 times. I keep seeing your face, which is also the face of your father and my brother. Like him, you were tough, dark, vulnerable, moody, with a very definite tendency to sound truculent because you want no one to think you are soft. You may be like your grandfather in this, I don't know. But certainly both you and your father resemble him very much physically. Well, he is dead. He never saw you. And he had a terrible life. He was defeated long before he died because at the bottom of his heart, he really believed what white people said about him. This is one of the reasons that he became so holy. I'm sure that your father has told you something about all that. Neither you nor your father exhibit any tendency towards holiness. You really are of another era. Part of what happened when the Negro left the land and came into what the late E. Franklin Frazier called the cities of destruction. You can only be destroyed by believing that you really are what the white world calls a nigger. I tell you this because I love you. And please don't you forget it. I have known both of you all your lives, have carried your daddy in my arms and on my shoulders, kissed and spanked him and watched him learn to walk. I don't know if you've known anybody from that far back, if you've loved anybody that long, first as an infant, then as a child, then as a man. You gain a strange perspective on time and human pain and effort. Other people cannot see what I see whenever I look into your father's face. For behind your father's face as it is today are all those other faces which were his. Let him laugh, and I see a cellar your father does not remember and a house he does not remember. And I hear in his present laughter, his laughter as a child. Let him curse, and I remember him falling down those cellar steps and howling, and I remember with pain his tears, which my hand and your grandmother's so easily wiped away. But no one's hand can wipe away those tears he sheds invisibly today, which one hears in his laughter, in his speech, and in his songs. I know what the world has done to my brother, and how narrowly he has survived it. And I know which is much worse, and this is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I nor time nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it. One can be, indeed one must strive to become tough and philosophical concerning destruction and death. For this is what most of mankind has been best at since we have heard of man. But remember, most of mankind is not all of mankind. But it is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime. Now, my dear namesake, these innocent and well-meaning people, your countrymen, have caused you to be born under conditions not very far removed from those described for us by Charles Dickens in the London of more than 100 years ago. I hear the chorus of the innocents screaming, "No, this is not true. How bitter you are." But I am writing this letter to you to try to tell you something about how to handle them. For most of them do not really know that you exist. I know the conditions under which you were born, for I was there. Your countrymen were not there and haven't made it yet. Your grandmother was also there, and no one has ever accused her of being bitter. I suggest the innocents check with her. She isn't hard to find. Your countrymen don't know that she exists either, though she's been working for them all their lives. Well, you were born. Here you came, something like 15 years ago. And though your father and mother and grandmother, looking about the streets through which they were carrying you, staring at the walls into which they brought you, had every reason to be heavy-hearted, yet they were not. For here you were, Big James, named for me. You were a big baby. I was not. Here you were. To be loved. To be loved, baby, hard at once and forever to strengthen you against the loveless world. Remember that. I know how black it looks today for you. It looked bad that day too. Yes, we were trembling. We have not stopped trembling yet. But if we had not loved each other, none of us would have survived. And now you must survive because we love you. And for the sake of your children and your children's children. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that. For the heart of the matter is here, and the root of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were black, and for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways as possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned, James, in your short time on this earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do and how you could do it and where you could live and whom you could marry. I know your countrymen do not agree with me about this, and I hear them saying, you exaggerate. They do not know Harlem, and I do. So do you. Take no one's word for anything, including mine, but trust your experience. Know whence you came. If you know whence you came, there is really no limit to where you can go. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. Please try to be clear, dear James, through the storm which rages about your youthful head today, about the reality which lies behind the words acceptance and integration. There is no reason for you to try to become like white people. And there is no basis whatever for their impertinent assumption that they must accept you. The really terrible thing, old buddy, is that you must accept them. And I mean that very seriously. You must accept them, and accept them with love. For these innocent people have no other hope. They are, in effect, still strapped in a history which they do not understand. And until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. And they've had to believe for many years, and for innumerable reasons, that Black men are inferior to white men. Many of them indeed know better, but as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You would be frightened, because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own reality. Well, the Black man has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, as an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. You don't be afraid. I said that it was intended that you should perish in the ghetto, perish by never being allowed to go behind the white man's definitions, by never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention. And by a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believed that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp of reality. But these men are your brothers, your lost, younger brothers. And if the word integration means anything, this is what it means. That we, with love, shall force our brothers to see themselves as they are, to cease fleeing from reality and begin to change it. For this is your home, my friend. Do not be driven from it. Great men have done great things here and will again, and we can make America what America must become. It will be hard, James, but you come from sturdy peasant stock, men who picked cotton and dammed rivers and built railroads, and in the teeth of the most terrifying odds, achieved an unassailable and monumental dignity. You come from a long line of great poets, some of the greatest poets since Homer. One of them said, "The very time I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains fell off." You know, and I know, that the country is celebrating 100 years of freedom, 100 years too soon. We cannot be free until they are free. God bless you, James, and Godspeed, your uncle, James.
That was extraordinary. Thank you so much. Yeah, that probably takes a certain wherewithal. I'm curious to know when you first encountered Baldwin's work, if you remember when you first read it.
I mean, how could I not forget it? I know exactly. I was 16 years old, and I read Giovanni's Room. And I wanted to read from that originally, but this seemed more of the moment. But I remember reading Giovanni's Room, and for the first time, through his description of male same-sex love, understood that what I feel is not something to be shamed about, but something that was beautiful and real, and that I wasn't alone, and that men of color understood it as well. And after that, I read Another Country, which I'm also rereading at the moment. And I have to also say this, is that the books, those two books that I read when I was 16, when I'm 46 now, 30 years later, are two completely different books.
Yeah, that's
different experiences in reading them. And I have to say, in reading this, when I was preparing for it, took on a brand new and more urgent meaning. You know, this morning I was watching the memorial of George Floyd, and Reverend Al Sharpton was giving his eulogy. And I felt like I was obviously not hearing James Baldwin, but I heard James Baldwin in his voice when he said, "Your knee was on our necks." We could have achieved and been and aspired to be so many things, but you kept your knee on our necks. And I feel like it is a parallel message from what Baldwin was saying in this very piece that I just finished reading, that there were circumstances that Black men have had to live their lives within, that had nothing to do with them or what they were bringing to their lives, but what was being brought upon them. And it breaks my heart that we are still having the same conversation all these years, all these decades, all these centuries later.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, you know, when you said that they were two kind of different books between when you were 16 and where you are now, and you've spoken a little bit about this, but I'm just curious to know, like, is there one particularly glaring thing that you don't think you picked up on when you were that young age that you really see clearly now? Like, is there one thing that really stands out to you as being the lesson you've now learned over that period of time?
You know, when I was 16 and reading it, let's be honest, I was 16. So lots of things are going on in a 16-year-old body. And so I was drawn to the descriptions of the physical love, right? Like, because it was something that I had yet to experience. And I had never thought about it in terms of beauty and of love, really. But in reading it today, what stood out for me in Giovanni's Room was, or is, this overwhelming, arching theme of shame that Baldwin describes, that seems unrelenting, that seems to permeate everything that those two characters experience in that book. And shame is something that, as free as we find ourselves today in comparison to the past, is a battle and a war that we wage still daily for many of us. Those of us who work on it and go to therapy, the kind of shame that we're taught is hard to unlearn, and it's a lifelong battle. And the descriptions of it in Giovanni's Room are heart-wrenching. I mean, it's the entire book. It's the entire book.
It is. You know, it's fascinating because in his writing, there is, it's amazing to juxtapose it next to what you just read, because so much of what you're talking about in that book through fiction is about internalization. He has this amazing way of crafting the story about these two people, and you're there, and it's very much prose of place, and you know where you are. But there's this great emotional distress that's also braided through that narrative. But it's amazing to look at something you just read, which is so squarely on point. It's almost external in a way that isn't necessarily, you know, where he's just making the themes as, you know, clear as possible and writing toward that in a way that's so direct. And the fact that he had the capacity as a writer to be able to do those two different kinds of things, just speaks to his, vision, I think.
It also moves me that he felt compelled to have to say these things.
Right.
The conversations that parents of color have to have with their young children every day to this day to help them understand the world that we've brought them into. That while we love them and have such hope for their futures, we also know and have to convey to them the struggle that they're going to have to endure in order to achieve it all. And that, like I said earlier, that we're still having those conversations, maybe more so. I don't know. I wasn't there, but I know that I'm hearing those conversations today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about something like Between the World and Me, for example, which, was a very, I think, a conscious sort of, evocation of the book from which you just read. And I think the same thing, you see some of these similar themes emerging in a book like that many years later. One of the questions we got, which I think is a great question, which I was actually wondering as well, is have you considered doing audiobook narration? Because you're so good at reading.
I haven't, but I would love to, because I'm a big audiobook listener.
Yeah, it's that I think you could choose any number.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
What are you going to say? I'm sorry.
And I was going to say, actually, to that question, are there other books that you would like to read aloud? Like, are there ones that speak to you so much that you could think, oh, I would love to do a reading from that or that?
Can I tell you a secret? So during this whole quarantine and the self-isolation, I've been here by myself. And, I'm a creative person. I need a creative outlet. So I have literally been giving one-man shows here to myself.
That's incredible.
I've read 5 books in the last 3 months or something, and I have read each of them out loud.
That's great.
Because I think as an actor, when I'm not able to do my job, I need to keep it fresh. And so one of the ways is to take on these new voices, take on these stories and embody them in some way, in any way that I can for my own entertainment. But it helps me hear different voices and helps me use my imagination in ways. So my mother's calling me.
She probably saw your reading and loved it. That's why.
Oh my God. Sorry, I'm trying to get out. Okay. Mom, I'll call you back. But yes, there are many books that I would love to read out loud. I actually read, which was actually a lot of fun to read out loud, was The Immortalist just recently. That one was fun to read out loud. But Giovanni's Room, I have to tell you, the richness of that language, the intimacy of it is also really beautiful to read out loud. Another country, actually, the first 3 pages, the first 2 pages are some of the most beautiful English language prose I've ever read. His description of New York, it's gorgeous. So I read out loud a lot.
That's amazing. I mean, I think, one of the other questions we got, which I think is a wonderful question to ask, is when you're going through a piece of like this that you're going to read, what are the considerations you're taking into mind in terms of how you're going to interpret it? Because obviously, the great thing as a writer like Baldwin is such a skilled writer that the language leads you in a certain way to be able to craft it in a certain way. Obviously, you're your own performer and you have your own inimitable way of interpreting that. So that is a good question. Like, kind of, what are you thinking about? What are the pressure points you're kind of putting into the work, and what's your process for kind of interpreting it that way?
Well, I mean, I think like any monologue, I treat it like any monologue, which is, what is my intention in saying these words? Like, what is driving me to make this statement? And when you start a letter, especially like that, like, what was the thing that made Mr. Baldwin take pen to paper and feel moved to say these things? And so my feeling of that is love, first of all, but also a frustration and an anger that we know is inherent in James Baldwin, or was, and a passion. I love watching him in YouTube clips that I can find, in which he is literally taking us to school at every given opportunity. So I think I thought a lot about that cadence when I was preparing this for you. But you know, I like to try stuff too, and I try to find in any writing the voice of the writer. But I also try to think about how I can enhance it with my own perspective.
Right, absolutely. And one of the questions we got, which it sounds like you've answered this question, but what is your favorite Baldwin? I know it's like picking a favorite child, but like what, if you had to pick a favorite book, what would it be?
I mean, you know, do you love anything more than your first love? I think I'd have to go with Your Mommy's Grave.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I literally, when I think about it, I think of myself in my parents' home, in my bedroom, on my bed, lying on my back with my little paperback, and disappearing into a world in another time, and going into it thinking I was going to understand their experience, but coming out of it understanding my own.
Perfect. Yeah, I think one of the questions we got was, I think originally you were going to maybe even read Paul Monette, but you chose James Baldwin. And I mean, two amazing writers. I'm curious, you know, was it really that sense of like, this is the moment, this is something that's being said that I just feel like, you know, it's made for now? And to the flip side of that, what do you like about Monette that you would want to read too? Like what about his work moved you?
You know, Monette was transformational for me, right? For me, he was a poet in many ways, but he was also an activist, and I feel like he purposefully was an activist in his writing. I felt like it was a calling out. He was leaving something for us because he knew he wasn't going to be with us for very long. And so it was a cry in the dark for me. And Becoming a Man I remember I read Becoming a Man, most of it on a train ride. And so I think of it in that train ride. And I feel like at the end of that train ride, I understood my responsibility to my community more than I did before.
That's incredible. I mean, it's funny. I was thinking in light of Larry Kramer's passing too, the point that you're making, which is that, you know, when we're growing up, we compartmentalize as if somebody was an activist and somebody was a writer. And we forget that those people can hold those identities simultaneously. And in fact, some of the most effective writers are in fact activists. And we don't think of it in that way because we're just used to, like, again, compartmentalizing. You read a book, it's over here. The lived experience is over here. So I can see what you mean by that. And it's funny, like, you know, when I read A Boy's Own Story for the first time, like I grew up in Cincinnati. So I grew up in the city in which he was, you know, in which Ed was writing about. Yeah. And I like it, even though I was reading about something, it was almost subconscious where I didn't necessarily understand that, like, to draw that line, even at that young of an age, to understand, like, that's reflexive. Like it reflects some of my own experience. It's not just something I read in a book. It's actually some lived experience that's put in a book. And I think another question we got was, and I love the pairing of these questions, which was, who introduced you to Baldwin? Like, was it a book you found in a store or something? And did you readily know him as a queer author? Like, were you drawn to it because you knew he was queer, or was that something you just found out by happenstance afterward?
So, unlike our young people today, God bless them, who I love, I live for them. I had no examples on television or in the media of gay men of color that I could point to or go to for insight. And so when I was 16, I was part of a group. There were 5 of us who were out to each other. And because our history and our literature isn't necessarily taught in school, and even Baldwin, you know, it's not the first thing that they tell us about him. Right. We were educating ourselves and doing research ourselves on LGBT writers and LGBT history, and all of that. We went and found out ourselves. And in that search, I found James Baldwin. I'd heard about him, but I knew him as an African-American civil rights, an author who lived during the civil rights era. But at that point, it hadn't been communicated to me that he was gay.
Right.
When I found that out, then I just wanted to read all of it. and literally formed me. I feel like I'm not Black, but I feel like I am a direct descendant of his.
That's incredible.
That my life is possible because of the work that he did, because of the words that he laid to paper, because of the stories that he chose to tell, so that people could understand us. And so when I became an artist, a professional artist, I wanted to be the kind of artist who used his art in order to illuminate the experiences of LGBTQ people, because I understood what an artist like James Baldwin did for me.
That's amazing. I mean, I think what the point you're making too is that, first of all, books give us language, so they give us ways in which to use language to identify things. Maybe again, we know subconsciously, but we haven't vocalized to other people. So I think that's a really strong thing and a moving thing. And I think also that artists create space for other artists. You know, so by having a conversation that he was having, you were able to internalize that in your work and actually carry the torch, you know. So that's a powerful message to think that that's what art can do, and what a book can do.
Can I just say that for years, I have said, when I've spoken in front of groups or whatever, I've said that when people say, what is the meaning of life? For me, the meaning of life is how we use our own lives and our own experiences to inspire another generation to move beyond our own limitations, right? So James Baldwin took whatever limitations he was experiencing, which we know were a lot, and pushed that boundary. And my job was to come after him to push it even further. And so then those who come after me will continue my work, and so on. And that's how we create a world that exists on a TV show called Star Trek.
Correct. Absolutely. Well, I mean, that's such a great through line to look at where you went from Rickie to that, like the space you were able to create by that.
Yes.
And again, you made this point earlier, until you see it, like the visualization is so important for people to see themselves represented in that way and to read themselves represented that way.
I needed that so much, by the way. Like
Yeah.
I felt invisible in the world, which is why it was so important for me to be visible when I had the opportunity to be.
Absolutely. Another question we just got, which I'm curious about as well. What was the last book you read?
I'm reading Another Country right now. I finished Giovanni's Room because I reread them. I was like, I read them 30 years ago. I should read them again. So I read that.
Yeah.
But before that, I read Afterlife by Julia Alvarez.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I can just tell you, I read The Immortalist. Oh, here they are. Next on my list. Oh God. Go away. My library. Here we go. So I have, what did I read? Julia Alvarez, The Immortalist, Giovanni's Room. Oh, you know what I read earlier this year, which I'm still kind of reeling from. And I literally took, I'm not a slow reader, but I had to take 6 months to read this book because it wore me out. It was A Little Life by Hannah. Like every 2 pages, I was like, that was amazing. I have to put this down.
I will tell you a funny story that my friend will hopefully not mind my telling you. I literally almost came to fisticuffs about that book at the cubbyhole because I love it so much and he did not like it. And we were just like at each other and I was like, oh, this was good books can do. They cause arguments, you know, like people can actually discuss them that way. Go ahead. Sorry.
I didn't know if you were done. I know I love a good book when I'm done with it. I have literally I miss the characters.
Yeah,
right? Like,
absolutely.
About 2 weeks after I finished A Little Life, I was like, why am I so sad? And it was like I hadn't heard from Jude.
Yep. You feel bereft.
I missed being in his world. As painful as a world as that was, I loved him so much.
Yeah, I love that book. Another question that we got, which a really great question. The last line of the passage that you read, which is "We're not free until they're free," is so powerful and relevant to Giovanni's Room, and even Jeremy Harris's work. So the question is kind of, do you see a through line from that message to other writers' work and maybe contemporary writers' work and how they're thinking about things?
Well, I mean, you can't, I mean, the first name that came to mind was Toni Morrison, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
you can hear Toni Morrison almost in that piece.
Yep.
Who, by the way, is probably the biggest loss we've had this year. I mean, we've lost a lot of people, but that loss was.
Yeah, I agree.
But yes, so there's that. I don't know that there's anybody who's, I mean, there's Ta-Nehisi Coates, of course, who you can hear also is inspired by Baldwin. But there's nothing like James Baldwin, though, because of the specific time that he was in and the bravery, the courage. I mean, it's courageous to be out now. I want people to think how courageous it was, especially in terms of the 2 feet he had to place in 2 different communities, right? You know, he was speaking to African Americans about about gay issues, and he was talking to LGBT people about African American issues. So, you know, that intersectionality, that conversation wasn't being had by anyone except him at the time. Not on the level and stage that he was having it on, for sure.
Right, absolutely. I think we're almost wrapping up, but I'm just curious to hear from you if any, you know, this time is difficult for a lot of people. I think we're all kind of, you know, it's a struggle. It's unprecedented in many ways, and it's a challenge. And it's so inspiring and heartening to hear about the way you're thinking about your art and your work. And I'm just curious if you have any advice for people who are feeling, you know, stymied, be it artistically, be it just socially. You know, have you found things that have helped you and grounded you that, you know, that you would like to share with other people?
You know, when I think about Pride, right? Like we're in Pride season now. I think about all the people who brought us here. You know, who literally brought us here on their shoulders and on their backs, and who are no longer with us. And so I wonder if it's, since we can't really gather in the ways that we are accustomed to in Pride, that we go back and listen to the voices that we ignored as a community in the past, and go back and educate ourselves and listen. We do a lot of talking at Pride. And I'm wondering if this year, those of us who have had to navigate the intersectionalities and have to code switch, that perhaps this year we do no code switching. And those of us of color actually use this moment to speak to it and give others the opportunity to listen, and see what that births, what creativity, what new world, what new experience, what new art that creates for us. I think this is a rich time for the creative soul. You know, so many people are making speeches and they're talking about legislation and politics, and I'm all about it, and we all have to vote come November. But there's something that the artist does that the politician and the lawyer can, and that is speak directly to the soul and the heart. And I beg every artist, every LGBTQ artist, especially every LGBTQ artist of color, to close your eyes, listen, and speak to us from the place that you have always been afraid to speak to us from. To allow us to give you permission to be your complete and whole self in our community. You know, I've been telling people that we have to be better allies, but that seems to imply that this isn't our fight. This is our fight. Because you can't separate the African American experience from the LGBTQ experience, because we are here. We are part of this community. So any struggle that community finds itself in is our struggle, because those are our brothers and sisters. And we have failed them in many ways, but we have an opportunity to do it differently now. And I have to say, I've been out in the marches for the last couple of days, and I've been moved many times. But one of the things that has moved me the most is the way that LGBTQ people have placed their bodies in front of African-American people who are in danger at these protests at times, who've placed their bodies between police officers and sheriffs and African-American bodies and said, no, you have to come through me first. And I've never seen that. That's a different thing.
That's so amazing. And I just have to tell you what I find most powerful about what you just said. You can hear Baldwin in you. You can hear it in the way you're talking about it and the way you're phrasing it, the words that you're using to describe it.
Well, that's the highest compliment you could pay me.
And that shows the power of books and what they're capable of doing. So I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this and to share your words with us and Baldwin's words with us. And I wish you health and safety, and everybody watching this crowdcast now or later. And please support Lambda, lambdaliterary.org. It's a vital organization. I'm so proud to be a part of it. All of the programs are really directly helping our community. And we're really, really trying to, as you're saying, pave the way for the next generation. So again,
please join me. I will be making my donation right now in helping Lambda Literary. This time has been especially difficult for LGBTQ nonprofit organizations. So many of them rely on this time of year in order to facilitate their budget fundraising.
Yep.
So that's harder this year. So these are the organizations, this is the infrastructure of our community that allows us to continue to fight for our freedoms and for our cultural souls. And so we can't just let them die off because we're having a difficult moment. So please continue to support the LGBTQ nonprofit organizations that have helped you realize your own freedom.
Wonderful. Thank you. And for those of you who enjoyed this event, we have other events coming up this month. You can find them at our website, again, lambdaliterary.org. Wilson Cruz, thank you so much. And
I love you guys. Happy
Pride. Love to
Pride.
everybody. Thank you. You too.
Be safe.